So welcome to the Better Players, Better People podcast. Welcome, Jake Brown. Welcome to Dubai. I know you've landed this morning. How are you feeling?
Feeling fresh.
You okay?
Yeah, pop curry sweats down, so I'm energised, and the weather helps as well.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, a bit better than London.
So, Jake, we met last term. You came into my school. We got to know each other through a friend of a friend, and you delivered an amazing assembly to our sports students on all things sports psychology. So, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself, Mindframe Performance, and what are you doing in Dubai?
Yeah, so my name's Jake Brown. I'm a performance psychologist and founder of Mindframe Performance. We're a leading sports psychology consultancy in the UK, and we've recently expanded out to the UAE, and we help sports people in all sports, all ages, all abilities, essentially to help them think better, feel better, and perform better.
Jake, you said something to me off camera before about, I think it was 80% of the people you work with are amateurs. Now, I was a bit surprised by that because given, the pedigree of yourself and what you know about sports psychology, and you've not name dropped, I know you can't share names, but some of the football clubs you've worked with or the high-end sport, I was a bit surprised that you've got such a high number of amateurs. Can you tell me a bit about that part of the business?
Yeah, definitely. I think when people hear what I do or what we do, everyone thinks it's elitist, that you're working with the elite of the elite. And don't get me wrong, we work with elite performers, but at the end of the day, to regulate your emotions, to manage your thoughts, to focus, to perform, to regulate what goes on in your mind, doesn't matter what level you're performing at. Everyone needs these skills. So something that's very surprising for a lot of people, 80% of our client base are amateurs and 60% are juniors as well. That's something I'm personally very passionate about. So I played to a high level of sport when I was younger, played academy football, and then was trying to get a scholarship for golf out in the States. I fell out of love with football. I just missed out on the scholarship because I used to get in my own head. I'd overthink, I'd get anxious, I'd get nervous, I'd get off to a bad start, and then I just ruined my chances for those big competitions. So yeah, something I'm really passionate about is helping junior athletes get to that next level, whether that is whether that's getting to a scholarship, whether that's going professional or just achieving their potential. I'm hugely passionate about helping junior athletes access these tools because everyone recognizes sports psychology as a vital part of performance, but it is by far the most undertrained aspect of performance. Everyone talks about how important it is, but no one does anything about it. So yeah, that's something I'm hugely passionate about, making sports psychology simple, fun, and accessible so more people actually use it, so they can actually apply it in a simple way so it's not confusing and they can actually reap the benefits.
Yeah, and look at the delivery of the assembly to our students. It was just that. It broke it down. It made it simple. In fact, we'll get into this later, but you actually did some exercises with our kids. I think it was box breathing and things like this. And you could see it in front of our own eyes. You could see it have an impact. I'm guessing that's a large part of the reason for the visit to Dubai. You've got some work with academies, is that right?
Yeah, definitely. So we got some really exciting partnerships in the region. A couple of big swim academies we're partnering with. We're launching with Speedo on Saturday and then running an event for the Claude Harmon Golf Academy on Monday. So yeah, really excited about that. And yeah, really excited to be partnering with some great academies in the region and providing them great sports psychology support. And just adding to that point, if something's complex, you're not going to do it, right? If you have 2 things to do or 20, what do you think you're going to be more likely to do? And that's something I really want to get across. Sports psychology doesn't have to be complex. Yes, some of the things that underpin it are complex. Some of the theories, some of the understanding how the brain works, understanding the response in the nervous system. Yes, it sounds complex, but the simple takeaways can be really, really basic. And again, the fewer things you have to do and the simpler they are, the more likely you're going to do them and the better you're going to be at them as well.
The aim of this podcast, Jake, is to try and reach out to parents, and I found a lot of secondary students are engaging with it as well. They'll come up and tell me that they've seen the podcast and they've watched it, and some of them are asking now to be on it, which I think is really nice to hear. So they're taking on board what we're putting out. The big thing for me when I sat in that assembly and I watched the delivery of these tools and skills, which was designed maybe for performance, was just what you've just said. It could transcend sport. So me speaking personally, and I've got a copy of The Chimp Paradox here. That's been the book I've read lately, but I think back to reading The Inner Game of Golf last summer.
Yeah.
And it had some really easy tools that I could apply to my game. I'm an amateur golfer. And it is just that, isn't it? It's about understanding that the skills you're trying to develop can be used in elite sport, but also amateur sport and everyday life. I think that would be quite an important point.
Yeah, you bang on. Everyone thinks it's just the elite of the elite. Well, it goes into amateur sport, but they transcend context, right? The ability to deal with emotions, to regulate your thoughts, to focus. Doesn't matter whether you've got a golf club in your hand or whether you've got a pen and you're doing work at school. You need these skills. They're vital. I personally think they should be taught in school. I personally think they will be in 10, 15 years' time, depending on how quickly things move. But it's one of those things, everyone recognizes these skills are so important, but yet there's this massive gap between the action to do something about it. And with the work as well, yes, we've worked with elite athletes, but I've worked with an opera singer, I've worked with an artist, I've worked with traders, and that the question always comes, well, what are you doing with them? How can you work with them? Isn't that completely different? But an easy lens to view it through would be that you're treating patterns, right? It's patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. That's essentially all we can control. We can control, or we can certainly influence how we think, feel, and behave. Well, if you can break that down and simplify it, well, you can change what goes on in your mind. You can influence the direction of your thoughts. You can change your feelings. Everyone recognizes we can put ourselves in a bad mood, but they don't do what they can and change their thoughts and behaviors to put themselves in a good mood. So we can change our feelings, and then ultimately we control our behaviors. And if you break it down and keep it as simple as that, if all I need to do for performing, whether that's an exam, whether that is a match, whether that is a performance in front of a big crowd, well, if all I can do and all I can control is how I think, feel, and behave, then again, all of a sudden it becomes a lot simpler. And by breaking it down and taking action on the things that are actually within your control, that builds confidence because you're moving the needle and improving that performance in a sense as well. So the simpler the better, but viewing it as patterns is a really simple way to understand it, right? No matter what you're doing, you're thinking, you are having some emotion or feeling, and you're ultimately behaving. So treating it as a pattern or viewing it through a lens of dealing with patterns is a really good way to understand how the skills transcend context.
I want to go back a little bit, because you've just mentioned there an opera singer and a trader, amateur sport, elite sport. I know who you have worked with in terms of the context of elite sport. Can you just share a little bit on a bit more of the breadth of who you work with? Because I think it'd be quite nice for the viewers to know that there's Premier League footballers. I think that'd be right to say.
So
that
we've
clients.
done Premier League footballers, we've done Olympians, we've done 3 out of 5 of the major European leagues, DP World Tour Golf, just about every major league you can think of in sport. We've worked with an individual from that, so national athletes, national champions. It correlates quite closely with the popularity of sports. So football, golf, tennis, cricket, swimming, gymnastics, those are the popular ones. But yeah, it's been really cool. There's a team of us back in the UK that wicked practitioners, and it's been great to work with such a diverse range of people, backgrounds, and athletes, and you learn from them as well, right? Something that an opera singer might do or an artist might do to prepare might help someone in a sports setting. So again, having that diversity is really important, and it helps us as practitioners too to learn more skills and apply them from other contexts.
And would you say, do the elite also have the same issues and struggles as the amateurs? And if so, what are they? What's the most common struggle that performers have?
Everything's relative, right? So you could get nervous at a game of 6-a-side, or you could get nervous at a World Cup final. But again, those symptoms, in a sense, that you get overthinking, you get panic, your heart rate goes up, you start sweating, they're exactly the same. So the most common issues that we see amongst athletes are performance anxiety. By far the most common area is performance anxiety. They get nervous, they overthink, they place this rigid set of conditions on themselves before they perform, which are avoidant of making mistakes. They create fear, they create tension, and it ends up that they probably play safe on the pitch. They avoid taking risks, they avoid making mistakes because they're playing with fear. Anyone who plays with fear is not going to play well. Right, overthinking and tension are 2 of the biggest killers of performance. When you carry them out onto the pitch, you could be the best performer in the world, right? You could, but if you imagine that your potential is 100%, but if you have performance anxiety, if you lack confidence, if you're overthinking, if you have tension, if you put pressure on yourself, if you put, perfectionistic tendencies that cause negative reactions, we can come to that more in a second, but the more conditions or more things that you have blocking off your ability to perform, well, you might only be able to perform to 40, 50, 60% of your potential. And you can put all the work in training, you can do all the extra work, but if you can only access 50% of that, all that work will become redundant. Yeah. So one of the biggest things, and a simple frame as well, is we want to help athletes get out of their own way. When I talk about getting out of your own way, I mean getting out of your head and into the moment, stopping overthinking, stopping the bringing that fear that you carry into performance, that constant worry about past or future, what someone else is going to think about you, what's going to happen if you make a mistake. Mistakes are inevitable, right? The more you try to avoid a mistake, paradoxically, it increases the chance of it happening. It's a bit like, you ever carried a mug of tea up the stairs? You're going up the stairs and you say, don't spill it, don't spill it. All of a sudden you've burnt your hand and you've ruined the carpet, right? The more you try to avoid something, the more it ends up happening. So that is probably the worst thing, and this a bit sinister, but if you want one of your mates to perform badly, tell them to not make a mistake, because that will cause them to tense up, overthink, and play with fear and lose their freedom.
Everything you're saying there, when you're speaking, what's in my head is I'm adapting that to youth sport, and I'm thinking, we say this time and time again about trying to develop skills in young players, but we create an atmosphere or an environment where we probably create performance anxiety. And then you've got kids who are not elite. We're not talking about the elite now. We're talking about players who are still trying to harness those skills, but probably have got performance anxiety. I think probably, if I think back to my school days, I probably had it because it was maybe a win at all cost culture. And I wasn't, I probably played within myself. What's your experience working with young players, youth players maybe, or younger athletes, golfers, footballers, wherever it may be? Do you have to shift your approach, understanding that they're still developing the skills?
Yeah, for sure. And I think having some form of performance anxiety isn't necessarily all bad, right? Nerves are a good thing. They can help you perform when you perceive them in that way. There's a few different hacks that you can use to actually make nerves not just go against you, but work for you and enhance your performance. But when it comes to performance anxiety, I think most of the time everyone goes straight to the coach or the teacher and they think it must come from above, right? And don't get me wrong, a percentage of the time it does, but I would say 10 to 20%. I'm just guessing here, but I would say 10 to 20% of the clients we work with, it comes from the parent or the coach. And that is when they place rigid rules on outcomes. So I call these words psychological swear words, right? Need, must, have to, should, can't. If you think about a manager speaking to a player, an old school manager before a game, this is a must win today, right? We have to keep a clean sheet. You can't make a mistake. We can't give the ball away. You need to play your best. You have to win. All of these words, for some people, they can be motivating, but for someone with performance anxiety, they create fear. They create tension because you're not thinking about what you do want to do positively. You're thinking about what you want to avoid. And again, the more you think about what you want to avoid, it increases the chance of you carrying out that very same thing, right? You tell yourself, don't miss, don't give it away, don't have a bad first touch. What do? You end up going and doing that. So that performance anxiety can be driven by external factors, but for the most part, it comes from perfectionism. You will probably see high achieving sports people in your school are probably good at football, and then they're good at their academics, and they can play a music instrument as well. And they're these type of people who seem to be good at everything. Why is that? Well, because they're perfectionists, and they wouldn't be as good as they are if they weren't a perfectionist, right? Perfectionism can be really, really helpful. It pushes you to perform. It makes you always want to be better. It creates that obsession. And obsession is necessary if you want to get to the top. Yes, it causes negative consequences, but you need to be obsessed. You need to be committed if you want to get to the highest level. But the downsides of perfectionism come in the form of overthinking, anxiety, fear, avoidance, and you end up getting in your own way. The big difference behind a perfection. The big difference behind perfectionism, working for an athlete or working against them, is that you need to strive for perfection, but you can't evaluate yourself against it, right? So you want to try and be 10 out of 10. You want to try to be perfect, but you can't use that as your metric, because expectation dictates emotion, right? If you expect that you're going to be a 10 out of 10, and this is what perfectionists do, right? There's no in between. It's all or nothing. You have to be a 10 out of 10. That sets the expectation. The reality, even if you're a 9 out of 10, the bigger the gap between that expectation and the reality, the greater the emotion. So if you're a 9.5 out of 10, okay, that's a bit disappointing, it's a bit annoying, but it's not the end of the world. If you're a 7 out of 10, even though that's a decent enough performance, you're going to feel like it's the end of the world, right? The bigger the gap between reality and your expectation, that's the thing that creates emotion. The expectation you have beforehand is the thing that creates the emotion. Now, I think a big mistake that so many people make when it comes to sports psychology is they deal with the emotion as it comes up in the time. They deal with the thought, they deal with that frustration. They try and control all of their impulses around that negative reaction. But the bit that they're forgetting is it's the precondition that sets that expectation in the first place. By expecting to be perfect, by saying that they can't make mistakes, by saying that they have to perform perfectly every time they play, that is the thing that sets the expectation. And the thing is, even if you're a 10 out of 10, you're only ever going to feel like par. It's only ever going to feel neutral. You're not going to get that positive emotion. And the thing is, if you're a perfectionist, it's probably going to drain your confidence because you never feel like you're good enough. So that is the thing. So much of the time, it's internal high standards that cause that performance anxiety.
Everything, the internal high standards, and I'm trying to think about students I've come across who present that and display that, and then they tend to move on. But you've just said something that no one said on this podcast, and that is being obsessed. Can we unpack that a little bit? Because we know, coming from the UK, let's talk football, the players who are in academies in the UK probably are obsessed. They are on a different level. I think where we are in Dubai, I think this would be really good to touch on for Dubai parents, this idea of obsession. What does that look like, in your opinion or your experience? A young boy or girl, if they're obsessed, how does that manifest itself?
You have to love it, right? You have to be obsessed. And I know when I talk about obsession, I don't mean you can't enjoy it, because fun and enjoyment is a prerequisite for high performance. When you're enjoying something, you're going to perform better, right? Most people get that relationship wrong. They say, if I perform well, then I will enjoy it. But you need to flip it around. If you enjoy it first, then you free yourself up to go and perform well. But this element of obsession, it's a grey area to talk about, because yes, it can cause negatives. It can lead to burnout. You need obsession, but you need to balance that obsession with an equal amount of recovery, right? Because too much obsession without recovery is going to lead to burnout, not sustainable high performance. But the statistics of making it, right? If someone came in here and said, I'm going to make it, they're deluded, right? That it's delusion to think that you are going to make it when the stats and the probability is so low. But someone's got to do it. And I think delusion is a competitive advantage. I'm going to put an asterisk by that. You need to have self-awareness behind the delusion. But some of the best athletes in the world are deluded in the story that they tell themselves. But ultimately, the story you tell yourself, your perception, when I talk about the story you tell yourself, that's another way of saying changing your perception of how you're viewing that situation. But when you change your perception, that changes your subsequent thoughts, feelings, and behaviors around that. But this delusion element, I think it's really important, right? Not to the point that you lack complete self-awareness and you don't have a backup plan, but because that's dangerous. But you have to have that belief that you're going to make it, and you have to shape your life and do everything possible to make it, because the standards are so high. The standards are so unbelievably high. I've worked with some unbelievable athletes who are struggling to make it, are struggling to kick onto that next level. And if you saw them, golfers, footballers, tennis players, phenomenal athletes, but that standard is so high. And there's so many other people trying to do it. So you need to stand out in some sense. Work rate is a non-negotiable, right? Obsession is a non-negotiable. You have to put in the work. you can add talent on top of that. I think the biggest difference behind making that obsession translating into an outcome and high performance is getting the mindset right around it as well. But that's such a big thing. Everyone wants to be a sports person, right? Everyone wants to be a professional athlete, but very few actually end up going and doing it. Well, what's the difference? You have to love pressure. You have to be obsessed. You have to love those key moments. This is another thing that we can come on to in terms of making pressure work for you rather than against you. But a really easy way to understand how to perform well under pressure is to love it. Learn to love it. You might not love it right away. I used to be terrified of public speaking. And then eventually I did it, I built it up. I love it now, right? You can change. Fundamentally, you have to see yourself as having the capacity to change. That is essentially having a growth mindset. How you are now, how you feel and think right now is not how you will always feel. But this performing under pressure, you have to love those key moments because they make you feel alive, right? They create excitement. Nerves and excitement in the body are identical. The biological footprint of nerves and excitement is identical, right? Heart rate goes up, you get a bit shaky, you get a bit sweaty, you get palpitations. But whether you label that as excitement or nerves dictates your psychophysiological response, whether your brain and body work for you or against you. When you perceive a pressurized situation as negative, it releases cortisol into your blood flow. Blood vessels constrict and it lowers your oxygen transportation. When we're in that panic state, you lose 10 to 20% of intelligence. I know you don't need to do a maths exam when you're in that state, but that translates into decision-making, emotional control, reaction time, thought regulation. The other side to this, and this is called a challenge mindset or a challenge state, just by spending 10 to 20 seconds reframing a situation. So let's say you've got a cup final. Rather than telling yourself and putting yourself into a threat state where you say, oh no, I'm really nervous. I don't want to mess up. I don't want to lose. I'm going to make a fool out of myself. Everyone's going to be watching. This is going to be embarrassing if I lose. The challenge mindset of that is, and I use the word challenge and not positive because you don't lie to yourself. It still might be hard, but this is going to be a good thing. I'm going to enjoy it. I'm looking forward to it. This is going to be a good test. This is going to be a good challenge. But just by spending 10 to 15 seconds reframing that situation, changing your perception to get into a challenge state or a challenge mindset, it releases adrenaline instead of cortisol. Adrenaline causes the blood vessels to vasodilate, which means they widen. That increases oxygen transportation. It makes us stronger. It makes us fitter. It makes us endure longer. And the brain is a bit like a muscle. It needs oxygen to function well. We make better decisions. We regulate emotions better in this challenge state. One of the biggest hacks and the most simple things I could tell someone: view the situation as a challenge rather than a threat, excitement rather than nerves.
The example you give in the assembly was the guy who smiled. Was it Ronaldo?
Yeah, I love that video. No,
it was the rugby, wasn't it?
It was Damien McKenzie.
Yeah,
right. And I was connected with the sports psychologist at the time on LinkedIn, and they did a deliberate piece of work about initiating a challenge state. And a challenge state it occurs in the brain and body. The brain and body are far more intertwined than you would ever imagine. But what this guy does is, just before taking a conversion, and the video I showed, it was the last kick of the game. They were a point behind. If he gets the conversion, the team win. If he misses it, the team lose. Last kick of the game. Just before he takes the kick, he looks up at the post and he smiles. He smiled up at the post. Now, I think England footballers would have a much harder time if they did that at a penalty shootout. If they smiled, they get hammered in the media because everyone thinks, oh, they're not taking it seriously, they're messing about. But that is a deliberate way, and that's a wrong perception that would come out in the media, by the way, but that smiling at the post is a deliberate way to initiate a challenge mindset, to essentially tell yourself, I want to be here. I love these moments. This is why I actually train so hard, to be in these moments that are ultimately going to define the game. So these little hacks like that, smiling at pressure, just reminding yourself you want to be there rather than pressure being something that you want to run away from.
You shared that with our kids, and I'm just thinking now, recently, we've won some penalty shootouts. So I don't know. I was probably standing behind the players, the girls' football team. Maybe they were smiling before they took it.
Oh, what can I say? Mindframe Performance stuff works, right?
There you go. Let's move on to thoughts, because in front of me I've got some notes here for the podcast, but I've also got an email I sent myself during your assembly. So I was sitting there and I was making notes myself. The first one says, your brain lies to you.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, your brain is built for survival, not accuracy and high performance. So so many inbuilt tendencies and drivers that we have in the brain come from evolution. So a really easy way to understand how the brain works is if you think about a caveman, right? If hundreds of thousands of years ago, if you think about a caveman,
I'm gonna put the book on there. That's what I've been reading. Chimp Paradox.
So imagine a caveman comes across a cave, right? What is more beneficial to their survival? Remember, the number one job of the brain is to keep you alive, not to keep you healthy and happy and high performing. Sorry, I'll start that again. The number one job of the brain is to keep you alive, not to make you happy and high performing. Now, imagine a caveman comes across a cave, right? And they have two different thoughts. First thought is the positive best case scenario. Oh, that would be a nice cave. That would be nice and cozy. I'm going to have a good night's sleep there. Or there could be a tiger in there that could kill me. They come across a berry, right? First thought, positive. Oh, that would be nice. That will go well with my other shrubs. Or that could be poisonous. That could kill me. Even though it's not helpful nowadays, your brain has literally evolved and adapted to keep you alive. And to keep you alive, thinking about the negative worst case scenario is much more beneficial than the positive best case scenario. It's still the same now. If you're crossing a road, what do you want to think? Okay, I'm going to skip across and I'm going to be fine. Or there could be a car coming, there could be danger alert. So your brain is designed to keep you alive. There's this part of the brain called the amygdala. Think of it like a fear scanner. It's constantly looking out, constantly scanning around. What could go wrong? What could harm me? Your brain it's a survival machine, right? It's designed to keep you alive and avoid danger. But what we've traded in with that is accuracy. Because your brain has a negativity bias, we listen to negative thoughts we have more negative thoughts than positive thoughts. But not only do we have more in terms of numbers, but we apply more weight and validity to those negative thoughts than positive thoughts. They seem more believable. Now, the numbers around thoughts are really interesting. And I love saying these all the time because it normalizes it and it helps you detach from your thoughts and it helps you realize you are not your thoughts, right? Just because you have a thought doesn't mean it's you or real or true or accurate. Do you want me to run through them or should we test if you...
I'm going through the points here just to summarize because this is exactly what I wrote down. Your brain isn't built for high performance, it's built for survival. Your brain's default position is negative. So
default response is negative.
Let me just probably not summarize that, but bring that back into my world in terms of, well, there's a few aspects here. There's teachers, groups of teachers. If we know there's a negativity bias, me and my PE team, it's always about positivity, trying to just keep that positive flow going because if negativity creeps in, it grows and it can take over. But then in terms of youth sport as well, and we go back to what we said before about flow state, which we haven't really broke down yet, but keeping it positive. We have games in kids sport and the scoreline will be quite heavily weighted towards another team or, it could be a defeat. And it's just about keeping the positives there and bringing it back to the skill development. The numbers is the next thing I wrote down and this blew me away. I could not believe this. I think I went back into the office and I was asking everyone, how many thoughts do you think you have a day? So I'll let you share the numbers because it is mind-blowing.
Yeah, definitely. So just quickly on that point, the default position of your brain is negative. And this is why sports psychology is so important. It's not like you're starting off from a positive point. Already, we're starting off on the back foot. We're 2 steps behind because of the way our brains evolve.
It's not just sports psychology, though, is it, Jake?
No.
Because we haven't even got into it yet, but in terms of the corporate world, traders, like you said, opera singers, everything we're talking about can transcend sports. So,
no, you have to learn to work with that. But we'll go into the thoughts numbers because I think it's so interesting and I think putting numbers on it helps detach from the mind because it can be very hard to stop overthinking. It can be very hard to detach from your thoughts.
So how many thoughts is it a day we have?
Roughly speaking, you have between 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day. 80% of them are negative and 98% of what you worry about never comes true. Now, why I like those numbers so much is because if you have 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day, you can't possibly choose to consciously generate all of them. So that tells us a really important thing. Your thoughts happen to you. Yeah. This is going to sound a little bit weird, but where most people slip up is they get confused between thoughts and thinking. Thoughts is a passive process. They self-arise. It happens to us. It often comes from the survival parts of our brain that are designed to keep us alive. It's a protective mechanism. Our thinking, on the other hand, is something we do deliberately, it's an active process. So if I told you right now to close your eyes and imagine that you're at a football game, that is thinking. Whereas if you've got a thought that pops up into your mind, thinking about what you're having for dinner or a potential negative thought that might come up, that would be an example of a thought. So the other side to this, if 80% of your thoughts are negative, you wouldn't choose for that, would you? You wouldn't choose for 4 and 5 of your thoughts to be positive. But if 98% of them never come true, why do we listen to them? Why do we believe them? Why do we act in line with them? And a really important frame to view your thoughts through, rather than them being rational and completely accurate, your thoughts are inaccurate signals that you have a choice whether you engage with them or not. That choice is a skill. Don't get me wrong, that takes a lot of work to have that control, to be able to detach and separate that thought from the behavior. But that's so important. Just because you have a negative thought doesn't mean you need to act on it and engage in a negative behavior. An obvious example of this would be a negative thought is that I don't want to make a mistake, so I'm going to play it safe rather than trying to make a through ball or trying to hit a really good shot or trying to have a really good race.
60 to 80,000 thoughts a day.
Yeah, do you want to count?
I think when we guessed, I think people were guessing a few hundred. Just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for some people, most people start 50, then it goes up to 100, 500.
Some might have went 100.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then and went up. Okay. So, Jake, you mentioned something earlier on about flow state. Now, for some of the students, they'll know what this is. This is going to form part of GCSE or A-level sport. And also there's other things that you've said about biology, which I'll be chopping up and sending on to our academic team. Talk to me about flow state and how important that is for performance.
Every single world record or scientific breakthrough or musical masterpiece has come from a flow state. I think it's the most interesting thing in the world. It is the end goal for all athletes. It's something that they want to achieve. A flow state is a state where we think and perform at our best. It's an intensely enjoyable experience. Everything feels automatic. It feels natural. It feels easy. It feels flowy, right? Hence the name of flow state. A flow state is the technical term for being in the zone, right? You know, when you're dialed in, you're completely locked in, you're focused, everything becomes automatic. It's intensely enjoyable. The flow state is a really difficult one because you can't turn it off and on like a light switch. The more you try to force a flow state, the further you get away from it. And it can be quite a mystical state, quite a weird thing to talk about sometimes because it's quite different to a lot of other things. You can't think yourself into a flow state because a flow state actually involves less thinking. So I'll come on to what happens in the brain in a second, but it's interesting to hear where it comes from. So for years, psychology was dominated by fixing pathology, dealing with negativity, dealing with mental health. But in about 1970, and it followed on from Maslow, but in about 1970, there was this Hungarian psychologist called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. There's no way you could spell that, by the way, if you tried it. No, but he became really interested in why people engaged in behaviors for seemingly no reward. Before, everyone understood behavior by reward and punishment, right? If you got a reward, you repeat it. If you got punished, you wouldn't do it again in the future. And don't get me wrong, that is a factor for behavior change. But he found these people who would engage in certain behaviors, such as chess masters. This could be adventure athletes who would risk their lives for these actions for seemingly no reward. And it's something called an autotelic experience. When you do it, the reward is the activity itself for pure enjoyment, for pure fun. And he became really interested. Why did these people engage in these behaviors? And essentially what happens, the flow state, it's a state in the brain and the body, whereas it's this intensely enjoyable experience, and it creates this cocktail of the most addictive brain chemicals that go on in your brain that make it so enjoyable. So you get norepinephrine, which is essentially adrenaline. You get dopamine, which is the most addictive brain chemical of them all. You get anandamide, and you get serotonin as a reward. At the end of it, all of these are feel-good brain chemicals, and you also get some endorphins in there, which is that classic feel-good factor that you get after exercise. So these brain chemicals show up in this flow state, but they also enhance focus, pattern recognition, creativity, and performance. And it's fascinating seeing the jumps in some sports, the jumps of huge breakthroughs that seemed impossible before. Surfing's a big one, big wave surfing. Before, it was believed that, it was impossible to surf over something like a 20-foot wave. Now people are dropping into huge waves, and flow states show up the most in action adventure sports. Why? Because it's risk and danger and novelty when you're forced into the moment and you have no choice but to think about that. Now, that can be used to our advantage when it comes to triggering off a flow state. But I think a really important thing that I want to get across when it comes to a flow state is that you cannot think your way into a flow state. You cannot force your way into a flow state. Before, people thought a flow state was this optimization of the brain where you access loads of different parts of your brain and it's working in the most optimal way. What's that film where he takes the pill and he basically accesses?
Limitless. Yeah.
Is it Limitless? Yeah. People thought the flow state was a bit like that you'd access and unlock some new part of your brain and it would create this unbelievable high levels of performance. But actually what happens in the brain is something called transient hypofrontality. I'm going to simplify that in a second.
Need captions on that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Transient hypofrontality, it means temporary underactivation, so the opposite of hyper, underactivation of the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that's involved in decision making. Previously, it was thought that there was this hyperactivation of this part of the brain, so you were ultra focused and processing loads of bits of information. But research shows, and what transient hyperfrontality means is it's a deactivation of this part of the brain. More specifically, the part of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in doubt, second guessing yourself. A really important thing when you're making slow decisions, but when you're in the moment and you're performing at a high level, when you need to make rapid decisions, you don't want this part of your brain piping up and distracting you, because that will create the overthinking. So in a flow state, there's this shutting down and deactivation of that part of the brain that creates doubt. And this is what occurs in a flow state. Why it's so enjoyable, you're just doing it, right? It just happens. Less thinking, more doing. And that is why you can't think your way into a flow state, because overthinking is probably the biggest blocker of achieving a flow state.
So what does a performance psychologist do? With that knowledge you have, knowing how the brain functions when it's in that state, can you manipulate a performer to, maybe get into that state more often than not?
Yeah. So 3 things for this: flow blockers, flow triggers, and then mindset hacks to get you into that flow state, okay, or maybe routines to get you into that flow state. The biggest thing, if you want to get into a flow state, is to address flow blockers. Flow blockers are pretty much the most common areas that we work in sports psychology: overthinking, anxiety, spending too much time in the past or future, having an ego mindset, being too outcome focused. All of these are flow blockers. You can only achieve a flow state when you're in the present moment, right? Most people spend large amounts of their attention in the past or future, constantly worrying about what they've done or predicting some negative thing that might happen in the future. All of these block off your ability to get into a flow state. You can only get into the zone when you're in the now. So training your attention, mindfulness training, which I'm a huge fan of. We can come on to that in a second. This would be a strategy to train your attention, but an easy way to look at it would be to address the blockers first, because there's no way you're going to get into a flow state if you have performance anxiety, or you're trying to be too outcome focused, or you're trying to protect some ego. All of these act as a distraction. And if you have too much load going on in your mind, you're not going to be able to focus and dial into the things that really matter and almost let go to getting into a flow state.
You've just said train your attention, and you've also mentioned dopamine. Do you have any experience with the influx of technology and phones these days? Is that a problem for performers getting into the flow state? Phone usage, screen time?
Yeah, because it's a pattern.
Yeah.
Right. How you do anything is how you do everything. Phones are a really tough one, right? And I'm not going to pretend you're going to go back to the dark ages and you're not going to use phones or social media at all. It's a part of the game now. It's a part that athletes use and they make good money.
This goes out on social media.
Yeah, so, sure, right? It's everyone uses it. It's really important and it can be really helpful. But if you're spending hours a day on social media, you're just not going to make it. And I know that might be harsh to say. I know some people might not like hearing that, but not only is it a huge waste of time when all your competitors are getting ahead, not in a toxic way that you have to overtrain, but something that I think of a lot is you're training a pattern. You're telling your brain how to respond and act, and you're training that in. If you're training your brain to scroll on a phone and never focus on anything for more than 5 seconds before you skip to the next post or you skip to the next thing, when you have to sustain your attention and focus on a difficult task, and attention is a prerequisite for getting into a flow state, if your brain is so used to just jumping about and constantly going on to the next thing, you've trained a pattern in to tell yourself never to focus on one thing for more than 5 seconds. And it's going to have a really negative impact over time. It's going to drain your dopamine system as well. So dopamine is a brain chemical behind focus and reward. It motivates you. It rewards you for engaging in behaviors as well, but it also does a lot more than that. It helps you focus. It increases pattern recognition, which increases creativity. Creativity is a really interesting thing that occurs in the flow state, that you do things that you might have never done before. Yeah. You might have never trained them, but you put patterns together and you make good decisions based on that, your brain being able to process that data. But don't get me wrong, you can go on social media. It's not like putting a blanket ban on that, but don't do it before you perform, because it's going to drain your dopamine, right? What happens is when you engage in behaviors that, let's call this cheap dopamine behaviors. So quick hacks that make you feel good, but without the reward. So highly addictive behaviors such as social media or gaming or, other factors that maybe not for junior athletes, but negative lifestyle and addictive behaviors that can drain your dopamine system. What happens is these behaviors make you feel really, really good instantly, which spikes your dopamine levels. But your dopamine system is really clever. Because you didn't earn that dopamine, it needs to rebalance. So think of this like, this is just some abstract numbers. Imagine your dopamine baseline is a 6 out of 10. You go on social media and it makes you feel really, really good. So it spikes to a 9 out of 10. Because you didn't earn it through hard work, that dopamine system needs to rebalance, so it crashes to a 3. But when you're down there at a 3, it creates that craving to feel good again. This is the pattern behind all addiction, by the way, but it creates that craving to feel good again. So what do? You reach for the phone, you go for more junk food, you go to play more games, and this is the cycle of addiction. You get these intense highs and lows, but your dopamine system is going to deplete over time. And if you spend hours on your phone before a big performance, you're going to drain that brain chemical that causes you to focus. Dopamine is required to get into a flow state. Dopamine causes you to focus, but it also has other benefits, and it is a really important first step in the brain of getting into that flow state. So if you've drained your dopamine by engaging in addictive behaviors before a performance, again, you're already starting off on a back foot, and you're going to be distracted, you're going to procrastinate, it's going to be so much harder.
Wow. You said you can't go back to the dark ages, but I see it daily, and phones are not allowed in schools now. Largely in the UAE, phones will be away,
to see.
Locked away. I do see what happens at 3:30 onwards when the fixtures start and the training starts, and kids get the phone out the bag and they're straight on. So we have solved the problem largely during the school day, but they just need to get on that phone and probably get the dopamine fix. And
but it's hard.
It is hard.
I struggle with it. This is my job. I tell people not to. I struggle with it. I have to have an app lock on my social media till 5 p.m. because it's so addictive, and it's very easy to put the onus on the student or the individual going too much on social media. But what you have to remember is they have, without sounding too hippie here, they have teams of behavioral psychologists that make these apps addictive, so you spend more time on them. So you're up against a battle against clever behavioral psychologists who know how to manipulate your attention and focus. So it is really difficult, but putting safeguards in place is important. Set yourself a fair time limit. Is that 30 minutes a day? Even if it's an hour a day on social media, set yourself a time limit and live by that. Otherwise, you're just going to get sucked into these really addictive forces.
Yeah. I think that is everything you've just said there is probably the best explanation, description I've seen of why we should limit phones with young kids. Really is, that you've explained the dopamine levels and what that does to the body and how that leads to addiction. You see it. And never mind, we're talking about we want kids to perform academically, socially, in relationships, on the sports field. these phones, these devices are going to impact that, aren't they, if we don't manage them? So I am really pleased. I've got 2 kids in the schools here. I'm really pleased schools have taken that step to try and manage it and put things in place like you've just said.
But it has to come from them. If you set your own limits and your own goals, then you're going to live by it. If someone else tells you to do it, you're going to want to rebel against it. So a clever frame with this would be to say, what is a reasonable time limit for you to spend on it? When would be a good time for you to go on it? Make them set their own rules and make them live by that. They're going to be more likely to stick by it when it's driven from them and not told by someone else.
Yeah, good point. So Jake, you've mentioned and explained the barriers to the flow state. The other 2, flow triggers and training the skills.
Yeah, training the skills.
Can you touch on them for me?
Yeah, for sure. So there's 11 triggers to a flow state. The more you get, the higher chance you have of initiating a flow state. Like I said, you can't force yourself into a flow state, but you can set up the conditions to give yourself the best possible chance. The most important 3 are challenge, skills, balance, right? Roughly speaking, you want to be training or performing at a level that research shows roughly 4% above your current ability level. So it's this Goldilocks zone, the sweet spot. If it's too easy, it's going to be boring. If it's too difficult, it's going to create overwhelm and anxiety.
That's
so you want to be
4%.
pushing yourself. Yeah. You want to be training in discomfort. You want to be pushing yourself, but not so much. Finding what that 4% actually is impossible.
Yeah, because I'm
just
thinking
a rough
as a teacher
target.
or a coach.
But a rough takeaway is just above your current ability levels. So it's hard. You push yourself, but it's not too hard that it creates anxiety.
Yeah, okay.
The other side is you would need to have clear goals. You need to have a clear focus about what you want to do. When I talk about clear goals, I don't mean outcome goals. They're in the future, and that just acts as a distraction for your attention. And then you need immediate feedback as well. You need to know where you're at so you can tweak and adapt and adjust in real time. There's 3 more internal triggers, and then there's also 5 more external triggers. The external triggers are things like risk, novelty, unpredictability. You're not familiar with that situation. It comes back to a survival thing again, right? When you're in a new environment that you can't predict, it spikes your attention. The more your attention spikes, the more likely you are to get into that zone. So the triggers are really good there, but I think the bit that athletes can take the most away from and actually do something about to train their ability to get into a flow state is understanding what are the skills that are required to get into a flow state so I can start training them. A flow state isn't a skill, right? It's a state, but there's certain skills that increase your ability to get there. So attention is a big one to start with. Having a challenge mindset and loving the pressure and wanting to be there is important. If you're confident, you're going to be more likely to trust and let go and engage. So there's different things and skills, and these are huge things that we work on with athletes. We work on these skills to get them as close as possible to a flow state. But I think the best thing that you could do to get into a flow state is practice mindfulness, right? All mindfulness means is present moment, non-judgmental attention. You're training your attention onto the present moment. Mindfulness is a form of meditation, a bit like weight training is a form of exercise. I know when people hear the word mindfulness, they skip straight to a Buddhist monk in an orange robe with his head shaven in Nepal, right? That is traditionally where you'd associate mindfulness with, but mindfulness trains your attention into the present moment. Your attention being in the now is a prerequisite for getting into the zone. So one of the best ways you can train your mindset is training yourself to be present and training yourself to have a positive challenge perception. The other side to this is pressure training. Most people just go through the motions when it comes to their training, but I think it's really important that you should be a lot more deliberate when it comes to training. I would advise to split your training into technical practice and performance practice. Technical practice is when you're thinking about the movement, you're learning the skill. Performance practice is when you're performing under pressure. For pressure training, you want to match the training as closely as possible to the real thing. But there's 3 elements of pressure training that are important, and it's essentially creating games with yourself and an element of competition. You want a finite amount, you want to keep score, and there has to be a consequence. For example, you've got 5 shots, you have to score 3, or if you don't, you have to go and run to the other end of the pitch and back. It can be as simple as that. If you do it with a team element, that brings the social element in and it makes it a bit more effective and it creates similar feelings to the real thing. But I think the big mistake people make is when they think about practice, they think purely technical. But you can train your mindset alongside technical practice as well through pressure training. There was a thing I read about James Ward-Prowse. Obviously, he had an unbelievable run with his free kicks. Everyone thought, he must be taking hundreds of free kicks every week. It turns out he was only taking, it was either 3 or 5 after training. He only allowed himself that because that created the pressure. There's a finite amount. He kept scoring. The consequence would be however many he scored, or there could be a potential punishment or reward. Another side to pressure training, I would advise make the consequence physical, like a physical punishment. Drop and do 20 push-ups. Run to the end of the pitch and back and do it again. You know, I think for golf putting, you know, I know you might look a bit weird doing this, but let's say you have 5 golfers, you all need to make an 8-foot putt. If one of you misses it, there's the social element here, you've got to run to the end of the range and back. By the time you come back, your physiological reaction is going to be very similar to what happens under pressure. Heart rate goes up, you get a bit shaky, you get a bit nervous, you get a bit sweaty, there's something riding on it. By making a consequence physical, it can create the same physiological effect of nerves, and you can practice your ability to regulate yourself under those conditions. Another one, I can't remember if it was Harry Kane or Wayne Rooney. It might have even been both of them. They've both done all right for themselves, haven't they? They would practice shooting at the end of training session when they're tired, because it replicates the real thing as closely as possible. So some small tweaks that you can do for training, but be more deliberate with your practice. Have some clear goals, have some pressure, have some consequences. And research shows that deliberate practice doubles the effectiveness of it. I don't know about you, but I would rather achieve my goals in 5 years rather than 10, right? By being more deliberate with training. No extra time, not much extra effort, but intentional practice.
And it mimics the pressure.
Mimics the pressure.
Of the real life. Jake, before we leave, let's touch on behaviour training.
Mr. 75 hard.
We are we out of January yet? We're towards the end of January now.
Yeah.
January is the month of New Year's resolutions.
Yeah.
So I'll share just on my side. First of all, you've touched an awful lot on neural plasticity. There we go. I've got my big word in for the podcast.
Yeah.
And this was something I read about a few years ago, and the ability to rewire your brain. So I'll also share. Public speaking, I did not like.
Yeah.
So I've been put into situations in my job where I've had to speak in front of kids. It's quite easy because I think that's something I've done. But in front of peers and senior leaders and other staff, that can be quite daunting. And I've come to now enjoy that probably. Going back to what you touched on before, the hard 75 and setting a goal, making it deliberate. I wouldn't say there's really a consequence other than the fact that there's 4 cousins in the same WhatsApp. We're all doing it. So the consequence is probably a ripping if I don't post the day when I've done a workout. But yeah, let's touch on behaviours, because this is largely what you do. So before we finish, we've talked an awful lot about sport. If you don't mind, can we branch out a little bit? Because I don't know if you've done any work with the corporate world. You've done something with traders.
Exercise, corporate world too. It's essentially everything you're trying to do when you work with someone is create behaviour change. Behaviour
change, yeah. So for me, the hard 75, I'm 40 this year. I've got 2 young kids.
Airline's still intact.
It's still intact, but I just want to make sure I've got strong habits.
Yeah.
One is reading. I've really loved the reading. I've went through a number of books last year. I probably read more books in a year than I've read in 20 years.
Yeah.
And the impact that's had on my kids is they pick books up. They would anyway. I know they would anyway, but I think that's quite a nice thing for a dad to pass on to the kids.
Sure.
And also the healthy lifestyle aspect, because I'm not saying it wasn't healthy, but doing a challenge like this, you've got to get your workouts in and stuff like that.
You're a role model, right?
And the kids see that. So I do think that's had a behaviour change in me. What would be your go-to tactics, change in behaviour for someone who's to come into your company and say, I want to perform better? How would you go about changing their behaviours?
Habits and identity. There's a quote, I think it's John Dryden, you first make your habits, then your habits make you. Right? So you want to... Habits is a really interesting one. Roughly, on average, it takes 66 days to instill a habit, but the reality is that can be between 18 to about 260 days. So you have to stick with something long enough to do it. But... 75 hard. It's interesting. I've done this. I'm doing this for the 3rd year in a row. Yeah. And I know we've spoken at length about you doing this. The consequence of a 75 hard is if you miss one day, you have to go back to the start again. You look at, and it integrates clever behavioral psychology, Snapchat and Duolingo. Why do people go on them every day? Because you get a streak. Why is 75 hard so addictive? You get on a winning streak. This is one of my favorite things for behavior, and it leverages dopamine. Get on a winning streak with your habits, and get on a winning streak at the start of the day by winning your morning. You have to make sure the first few decisions you make in a day, you win those decisions. You see all this like Americanized military stuff about getting up and making your bed, but it's true. You get up and make your bed, you've won that little decision. And then you have a good morning routine. You maybe go and have a cold shower, you go and exercise. You've won that morning. Not only does it spike dopamine, which gives a reward, but that high level of dopamine increases your chance to engage in other behaviors. So winning the morning is really important. Having consequences are really important for initiating a behavior right away. So a reward or a punishment right away. If you make the punishment worse than the behavior, then you're going to do it. I read a story once about someone having a $100 bill pinned up on their wall, and if they didn't exercise, they were going to burn the $100 bill. He exercised every day, right? Bit extreme, but again, the point of if the punishment is worse than the behavior, you're going to do the behavior. Now, habits are really important to create consistency. Everyone can find intensity for short periods, but high performers are consistent, right? You want to find consistent levels of output and habits. Now, habits actually, it's really interested in the brain when it comes to habits as well. Initially, what happens, let's say you want to start exercising. Everyone starts January, right? And they say, oh, I want to get in good shape. I want to have a six-pack. I want to look really good. That's fair enough. But they're probably not willing to do the behaviors that are going to create that outcome. When you're first trying to exercise or engage in a new behavior, it's a very conscious process where you engage in this cost-benefit analysis, right? Where you're it's like a weighing up the pros and cons of doing the behavior. So you think, right, I need to go out for a run, but the immediate thought is, well, that's difficult. I don't want to do it. It's going to be hard. It's going to be effort. Whereas the other side of you is, oh, but it'll be good for you in the long run. It'll help you get in shape. There's this conscious weighing up process, and it requires impulse control, and it requires self-control to push through that. What happens when you ingrain a habit into your brain is that there's less activation in the prefrontal cortex, which is that decision-making part of the brain, and there's more activation in the basal ganglia, which is this stimulus-driven part of the brain. So rather than thinking about doing the habit, you just do it. So there's less, again, similar to a flow state, less thinking, more doing, but you have to stick with it long enough to build that habit in. And there's 5 triggers to a habit as well: time, location, people, emotion, and preceding event. For example, I'll go to the gym at 5 p.m. after work with my friend Joe, even if I feel tired. The more triggers you have of that habit, the more likely you are to do it. And the other side to this as well is with your bad habits, you probably can't, let's say you get home and you go on the sofa and you eat a load of junk food, same triggers, you're not going to remove those triggers, but you can replace the action. So those same triggers create a new association in your brain that when you get home, instead of going on the sofa and eating junk food, you go to the gym, for example. So habits are massive, and it's worth taking time to decide what those are. They are identifying those triggers, and then you need to reinforce that behavior in the short term long enough so it becomes a habit that you no longer need that reinforcement.
Win the Morning with Jake Brown.
Morning.
That might be the name of the podcast.
I like it.
We'll wrap it up on that, Jake. But listen, we're going to have to get you on again, because I know you could probably talk for a few more hours on this subject.
I've waffled a good bit here.
And we haven't even really got into the dynamics in youth sport and things like the area I work in. But I think people watching that are going to find everything you've just said super educational, interesting, and hopefully useful for themselves. So thanks so much. Good luck while you're over in the weekend with the academies that you're here. And hopefully we'll get you back on in the future. Yeah. Thanks, Jake.
And I'll give you some tips on the golf course tomorrow.
We'll try. Thanks,
Good stuff. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Awesome.